Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for January 19th, 2024. And if you're like me, you've probably heard some people say things like, hey, the founders weren't anarchists after all, in various scenarios, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but it's true, they weren't. But I think many of them were actually far more radical than most people today even realize. And before I get into some of the quotes that probably tell that story better than I could, I should point out that one of the big reasons that the Federalists gave for having to have a new constitution, having to have the Philadelphia Convention, having to have a stronger general government was over fear of the danger of anarchy and no government. And I think the best example, we see this all over the place in their writings and in their speeches, but one of the best examples comes from a letter from Henry Knox to John Sullivan right at the beginning of the Philadelphia Convention, or just before it. He said, impressed most fully with the belief that we are verging fast to anarchy, and that the present convention is the only means to avoid the most flagitious evils that ever afflicted 3 millions of freemen. So in other words, the danger was they were going to end up with no government. It was going to be absolute chaos, destruction, blood in the streets. The worst evil known to man, in essence, would be that. And this kind of thing was really hammered home in the Federalist Papers, Madison and Hamilton. You see this over and over. And in the Virginia and New York and other ratification debates, you see Federalists pointing to the chaos that was going to ensue if they didn't ratify. And Patrick Henry said, look, this is... Even though Patrick Henry was not an anarchist, I've got a great quote from him later on in the episode as well. But even though he was not one, he certainly was saying, look, you are fear-mongering and trying to rush us into approving a consolidated system over this type of a fear. Imaginary dangers is what he said. But here's Richard Henry Lee with a similar take. This is a letter to Edmund Randolph in October of 1787. He said, to say that a bad government must be established for fear of anarchy is really saying that we should kill ourselves for fear of dying. That's a great one. I've also seen that same quote put out there by John Williams in the New York ratification debates. I'm pretty confident John Williams was the anti-federalist writer Brutus. So this is a kind of a view like, look, okay, we agree with you that anarchy is going to be bad, but it's not the worst thing that we could face. On the other end of the spectrum, Pelatiah Webster takes the very similar view to Henry Knox. He said, a government we must have, and this is a letter to, this is an essay in November of 1787. A government we must have. There is no safety without it. Though we know it will be imperfect, we still must prefer it to anarchy or no government at all. I think it's a little redundant there, but the point he's making, just like so many of the others on the Federalist side, and Pelatiah Webster was a very much in support of free markets and free trade, getting government out of the way of things. But here he is pointing out that his view is, well, we got to have something. Even if we don't like what we have, we better ratify it. Otherwise, we're going to end up in anarchy and no government, and that's the worst of all evils. Not to William Pierce, though. In a letter to George Turner, he warned of something else. He said, to depart from the general freedom of our governments and to step into a monarchy which will at times be despotic, would plunge the states into a tumult infinitely worse than anarchy itself. Torrents of blood would follow the confusion. So in other words, centralized, consolidated government, just like Patrick Henry warned, was the greatest danger. Now, it's views like this, and I think it's pretty clear that the they weren't anarchists statement that people make is absolutely correct. It's used in various scenarios. Generally, when conservatives do that, they're basically saying, what, you want to get rid of this federal agency or this federal program, this particular one I like. So what, you think the founders were anarchists? That's crazy, man. But then on the other side, from anarchists themselves, we also hear people say this, basically that the founders were absolutely clueless about the danger of government. And I think both ends of this conversation actually miss much of the radicalism of the founders. On the conservative side, they're being far less radical than the people that they revere. And on the anarchist side, they're oftentimes dismissing people who are actually far more radical than, well, most people alive today. So I've got a few quotes that I think can really hammer this home here. If I can pull it up on the screen, let's start out with Thomas Jefferson. In a letter to Isaac Tiffany in 1819, I'm not going to cite all the dates here. We will link to them in the show notes. Over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, Alan Mosley organizes a blog post for every episode that we do here, and I'll get that published a couple hours after this live stream is done. That way you'll find everything that I'm citing in this episode and every episode. You'll find that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. So here's Thomas Jefferson says, rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within the limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. So that's rightful liberty to Thomas Jefferson. But he went a little further. I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of an individual. Now, this is sounds like a precursor to something that Josiah Warren, anarchist of the 19th century, wrote in his 1848 Equitable Commerce. He said, liberty, then, is the sovereignty of the individual. So sovereignty meaning final authority. So Warren, I've seen people make the claim that he was a descendant of the great patriot Dr. Joseph Warren, the great Revolutionary War hero. I don't know if that's actually been confirmed or not, but you can see how this lineage kind of connects, especially with Jefferson's view about how law is often but the tyrant's will, talking about every time that law violates the rights or the authority, the sovereignty, I guess, of the individual. Liberty, then, maybe I'm taking a little too far on Jefferson's take, but I think there's a connection here. Liberty, then, is the sovereignty of the individual, and never shall man know liberty until each and every individual is acknowledged to be the only legitimate sovereign of his or her person, time, and property, each living and acting at his own cost. And Jefferson has another take here that I thought was interesting from his first inaugural address. This is March 4th, 1801. Can you imagine a president coming into office and saying, hey, this is what we need to do with our administration? Check it out. A wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. So, to Jefferson, taxation is theft, at least on income. Maybe not on everything, but certainly on that. And here's James Otis Jr. In 1763, the rights of the British colonies asserted and proved, all the way back to 1763. No man can take my property from me without my consent. If he does, he deprives me of my liberty and makes me a slave. This is a precursor to a taxation is theft, something that's very popular amongst anarchists and libertarians in modern times. Now, Otis was specifically referencing this in relationship to being in a state of nature, but he saw representation, at least being a part of what constitutes consent. And now Lysander Spooner, in his No Treason number 6 in 1870, he took the same position that taking stuff from people without their consent constituted a robbery, an armed robbery. But what he actually viewed as being consent was far more limited than what someone like James Otis Jr. or many of the founders and old revolutionaries. He rejected the notion that representation was the same as consent. But anyways, here's Spooner's take. The fact is that the government, like a highwayman, says to a man, your money or your life. And many, if not most, taxes are paid under the compulsion of that threat. And then he goes on to explain that the government is actually worse than the highway robber, because the robber just steals from you and then heads off and robs somebody else. But government keeps coming back for more. He says, furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves you as you wish him to do. He does not persist in following you on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign on account of the protection he affords you. He puts protection and sovereign in scare quotes, which is awesome. He does not keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and forbidding you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it for his interest or pleasure to do so, and by branding you as a rebel, a traitor, and an enemy to your country, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority or resist his demands, like no one other than Lysander Spooner. But again, this idea that taxation could be theft It's just not as broad in every situation with the founders and the old revolutionaries, or here from the great Jeffersonian tier 2, John Taylor of Caroline, put it this way in 1814. Taxation to enrich a minority or aristocracy is robbery. To endow it gradually with power, treason. Now, Taylor felt that taxation in limited amounts for very limited purposes was okay, but everything outside of that is robbery. And I think that fits almost perfectly most uses of taxation today. So I think it is very clear that taxation is, as Murray Rothbard also put it in The Ethics of Liberty, 1982, is theft. I don't know if you can see this on the screen because the way the PDF scrolls here, but let me read it to you. This is Murray Rothbard, The Ethics of Liberty. I'll link to an entire PDF of that book so you can read it in full. He said, taxation is theft, purely and simply, even though it is theft on a grand and colossal scale, which no acknowledged criminals could hope to match. It is a compulsory seizure of the property of the state's inhabitants or subjects. Now, on the existence of government itself, we can go beyond taxation and things like that and get into the existence of government itself. Of course, that's what anarchists are concerned with. They don't want the state. But that doesn't mean that no one in the founding generation thought that the state was always a bad thing. They just, in some situations, were like, well, we still got to do it. And that's how Patrick Henry put it. He said that government, man, I'm stumbling over this one. Patrick Henry, Virginia Ratifying Convention, that government is no more than a choice among evils, has been a standing maxim for ages. And his argument was, man, if it's going to be a lot of evil, we should totally reject it. And it's okay. We don't have to be fearful of the anarchy that they're warning us about. And at the same time, he's like, well, if it's just a little bit of evil, let's go with that. So that's, I think, the big dividing line, the difference here. Now, Thomas Paine had a very similar take. And he put it this way. This is at the beginning, literally the first paragraphs of Common Sense in January 1776. Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. So the absolute best that government can get to, according to Thomas Paine, is a necessary evil. You can't get better than evil still. And of all the situations, everything else, other than the absolute best situation, it's something to not tolerate at all. Benjamin Tucker had a little to say on this in 1881. This is Declaration and Purpose. It's the first volume, first edition of his longtime publication, Liberty. He said, the state is said by some to be a necessary evil. So he's recognizing the same type of argument here. But it must be made unnecessary. This century's battle, then, is with the state. And he hits this home again. This is also in 1881. He said, now, what is aggression? Aggression is simply another name for government. Aggression, invasion, government are incontrovertible terms. The essence of government is control, or the attempt of control. And I should have actually had this great quote from James Madison. He said, the essence of government is power, and power, lodged as it is in human hands, is always liable to abuse. So it's not that far different than what someone would say is the far more radical Benjamin Tucker a century later. The essence of government is control. Madison is saying the essence of government is power. Maybe they're not connecting the dots on what the solution to that is the same way, but they certainly are recognizing the same types of problems. Again, that's Benjamin Tucker in 1881. Now let's go back to Thomas Jefferson talking about aggression, especially here when Tucker's talking about aggression is government. Jefferson had a precursor to what we often call the non-aggression principle today. This is a letter to Francis Gilmer in 1816. He said, no man has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another. Pretty similar to that one that I mentioned right at the beginning. Murray Rothbard points out that this is in War, Peace, and the State. Again, this will all be linked to in the show notes. The fundamental axiom of libertarian theory is that no one may threaten or commit violence, aggress, against another man's person or property. Again, not much different. Rothbard, who people with anarcho-capitalists, so anarchist on the right versus maybe the mutualism of people like Tucker and Spooner and Josiah Warren on the left, but still the same type of viewpoint. Jefferson saying no one has a right to commit aggression on the rights of another. And Rothbard, the ANCAP of today or modern times, is saying no one has a right, can threaten or commit violence, aggress against another man's person or property. He said violence may be employed only against the man who commits such violence. That is, only defensively against the aggressive violence of another. So the argument goes that the most important role of government then is defense, national defense, individual defense, local defense, the protection of life, liberty, and property. But Madison again recognized here in the Philadelphia Convention that government would use national defense as a way to attack your liberty. So again, recognizing the source of the problem. And here's how he put it. The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home. The means of defense, foreign dangers, are always the tools of domestic tyranny. He had almost the same take a decade later, a little bit more than that, in 1798, writing to Thomas Jefferson as well. But even for big government people like Henry Knox, who I kicked this episode off with, national security, national defense should be handled by the people at large, not government. If I were to tell people today, and I do actually, I tell people today that we shouldn't have a standing army. This is the bane of liberty, according to the entire founding generation, a large permanent standing army. If anything, it's going to be small or temporary, and a vast majority of national defense, of national security, should be handled by a people in love of liberty and well-trained in the means of defense and well-armed to be able to handle it. And here's how Henry Knox, he's the first Secretary of War in the Washington administration. And here he is sending a proposal on how to build up national defense to President Washington in 1790. He said, an energetic national militia is to be regarded as the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army forming a distinct class in the community. So if you were to tell people, hey, man, you got to get rid of all the national defense apparatus or a vast majority of it and focus on the people defending their own liberty, their own sovereignty, etc., they would think you were absolutely nuts. What? The founders weren't anarchists, pal. And that's the type of thing we've heard really often. But Henry Knox was no outlier. In fact, this was the commonly held view on national defense at the time of the founding. The people should be responsible for their own national security. I covered in some detail in a recent episode just earlier last week. Well, no, it was last week, Wednesday, I think. Militia versus Standing Army, the Founders' View. That will also be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But talking about this, let's go back to Lysander Spooner in The Unconstitutionality of Slavery in 1860. And he put it this way. There would be as much, talking about national defense, he said, Spooner said there would be as much reason in saying that a man must consent to have one of his hands tied behind him in order that his friends might protect the rest of his body against an enemy, as there is in saying that a man must give up some of his rights in order that government may protect the remainder. So this is Spooner taking this to the natural conclusion. If the means of defense against foreign danger destroy liberty at home, Spooner's saying, well, yeah, I agree with that type of a view. It's just that why would you make that trade-off? Why do you have to give up your liberty to be secure? The only way you can actually be safe is when you're free. And that's how he put it, really, well, much better than I can. Let a man have the use of both of his hands and the enjoyment of all his rights, and he will then be more competent to his own defense. His rights will be more respected by those who might otherwise be disposed to invade them. He will want less the assistance and protection of others, and we shall need much less government than we now have. Now, these views, especially on the militia, on national defense, are just straight up dismissed by a large portion of the population today, especially self-described constitutionalists. Unfortunately, so many of them who tell us they love the right to keep and bear arms also love the military and police state that we live under today as well. And so they say that this is just crazy anarchist thought. You're just nuts. This could never work, even though all the founders were on board with this kind of view. And I think they were actually much closer to some of these radical thinkers, whether it was Spooner or Rothbard or Tucker or Warren from the 19th and 20th century. So ultimately, wherever you land on the spectrum on this, I think emphasizing a culture of self-reliance and self-defense is what reduces the power and scope of government and advances and supports liberty. Now, how far people are going to take that, I have no idea. But I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed sharing this information with you. I do want to point out before running out for the weekend here, another episode. If you want to learn how I've covered a relationship between the founders and the old revolutionaries and Spooner and others in the 19th century on how to keep government in check when it doesn't follow the rules, I've got one more episode to mention. Compliance is Violence. Dickinson and Spooner on the Path to Liberty. I think it's a great comparison of how they've all viewed almost the same on how to deal with a government that doesn't respect your liberty, which is constantly here today. Anyways, again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed putting this one together for you. I hope you have an awesome weekend. Don't forget to, if you got a couple of minutes, you got a couple of bucks, head on over to 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There, you can join us for as little as $2 a month, and you can help us take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not, and they absolutely don't. So throw some of that dirty government fiat our way, and we will continue punching way above our weight class here at the TAC. Again, thank you so much for watching or listening to the show. Hope you have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.